So now currently what happens is anytime, let's say if we make any change inside our Express app, then every time we have to restart the server. So there is a very famous package called as Nodemon. Okay. So maybe I can close this or let's keep it like this. Okay. So there is a package called as Nodemon. Okay. What Nodemon as a package does is that whenever you actually make any changes inside your code, right, what it will do, it will automatically detect that, okay, some JavaScript file change has been done and it will automatically restart your server. That's the power of Nodemon. How can you set up Nodemon? So you can do npm install Nodemon, right? Just do npm install Nodemon inside your project. So I'm doing that in our to-do app that we created before learning the rest part. Right, and that's it. You have configured Nodemon. Now all you have to do is npx Nodemon and whatever file you want to run, that which is your main server file. So for our case, it is index.js. You start running it. Okay. Now you can see it has given some logs. For the moment, you can keep an eye on the log that what they are saying. And now let's try to change something. So let's say instead of saying console.log ping received, I want to say console.log ping received and a bunch of exclamations, right? Can you see the moment I saved it, it says restarted due to changes and it has automatically restarted the server. So if now I make a request to 3000/ping, you can see ping received and here we are getting the exclamation marks. Now let's say I want the exclamation mark in the returned JSON object as well. The moment I save it, you can see it automatically restarted your server. I don't have to restart my server. It automatically restarted your server. And now if you send the request, can you see the request has been updated? That's the cool part about Nodemon. Okay. Now the only thing is that every time writing npx Nodemon index.js might be a bit cumbersome. Now, first of all, you might be thinking, what is npx? So now Nodemon is a package of Node, right? It's a npm package. I want to execute a npm package inside my terminal, right? So if you directly write Nodemon index.js, most of the time the terminal won't understand what do you mean by Nodemon, because terminal doesn't know about Nodemon. Terminal might understand npm, because if you do npm -v, it understands npm, right? But it doesn't understand Nodemon. It's a third-party package. And for the moment, if you think about it, maybe let's say the terminal starts understanding Nodemon, but there are millions of Node packages, npm packages out there. It cannot understand everything. So if you want to execute a particular npm package in your terminal, you write npx. X stands for execute here. Okay, so you want to execute Nodemon package, and the Nodemon package takes the file from which you want to actually start with, that is index.js, and boom, you are good to go. So that's the meaning of npx. But again, this looks a lot, right? This looks a lot, and maybe currently we have index.js file, somebody else will be having server.js file, somebody will be having app.js file, things like that. So generally, what you will do is you will find that people will prepare kind of like a script. How about, doesn't matter internally whether we have a index.js file or server.js file as the entry point of the whole project. How about if somebody can write something like npm start, or let's say npm run dev. So if you're done, let's say React, there we just write npm run dev, and like in a white project, we just write npm run dev and a new React server starts. If you use create React app, we do npm start and a new React server starts, right? Maybe we can do that kind of a configuration for our backend project also. We can very easily do that using package.json. Okay, so inside this package.json, you can see there is a section of scripts. These scripts, what they do is that if you define a key, like let's say start, okay, and then you give this key a value, what should be the value? That let's say if I do npm start, I will just say npm start. Okay, you can say npm Sanket also, right? You can say npm start also, right? Whatever you want to write, just create a new command. Let's say start. What it will do is, whatever command you want to execute, if I do npm start, internally what command it should trigger, you can mention that here. So let's say it should trigger something like npx Nodemon index.js. Save it. And now if I do npm start, you can see it automatically turned up the server. But let's say if I do npm Sanket, can you see it says unknown command? But now instead of start, if I say Sanket, now it still says Unknown command Sanket. Did you mean npm run Sanket? Okay, let's try npm run Sanket. Okay. And can you see now it started? So generally the start command, it will automatically detect that, okay, there was a start command, because start is kind of like a special command that npm treats. But if you want to set up any other command, generally it will give you a recommendation that whether that command can directly execute or you sometimes might need to prepend run. Okay. So let's say if I do a start here, now you might be thinking, what will happen if I do npm run start? See, it still works. If I do npm start, then also it works. So there are few of the keywords that are known to npm packages. So for that, you might not need to prepend run. But if you have something custom, let's say start server, okay, something like this. So if you now do npm start server, you can see it doesn't recognize it. But the moment you prepend a run, now it starts recognizing it. So now you can say that we have actually configured a script for us. We have actually configured a script for us that any time we don't need to care what is our main entry point to the server code, what is our main file. We'll just do npm start and the server will be up. And now we can start making requests to the server via Postman. So this is cool. This is something pretty cool. And I would like to actually commit this. So git commit -m added Nodemon. Here we go. Now, a lot of time in your application, you don't want things to be, let's say, feeded in your application, and you want maybe things to be configurable. Let me make you understand what do you mean, what I say, like mean when I say making things configurable. Okay, so let's say you deploy this server on some cloud service like AWS. Deployment generally take process. So what will happen in the deployment is that you take your whole project and actually you will deploy it on, let's say, some AWS machine, right? Now, let's say there might be a few things that you might want to be configurable. For example, let's say the URL to the database. Okay, so so just like how you have this application server, you will be having a server which will be hosting your data store as well, where the actual data will be residing. Maybe in order to connect that, you need a URL. You want that URL to be configurable, right? Let's say when you are testing, you want that URL to be different, but let's say when a user is using it, that URL you want it to be different. This port variable, right? This is a system port variable, right? Maybe you want to make this configurable. Now, one way to make it configurable is that what you maybe store them in variables in your actual code. But what will happen is if you want to change this variable, you will need a new deployment altogether. But that might not be feasible every time, because generally when you work in a company, then there are deployment cycles. Like let's say in every 5 days, you do one backend deployment, something like that. Okay. So in that kind of a case, if you want things configurable, a good way to make things configurable is to store them in your environment variable. What's an environment variable? Let's say you run your node project as a process. Every process has access, like process is the actual runnable executable code, right? So every process has access to some variables that are available in your OS environment that particular process can access. Okay, so now I'll run this when I will run this express server, it will run as a process, right? That process will be you can actually give access to that process of some specific variables. You don't need to put them in your code, and you can directly actually change them from outside as well. These kind of variables are actually called as environment variables, right? So like there is a lot of things that you can actually read about environment variables. If you have a Linux machine, let's say I'm not sure about Windows. Okay. So let's say if you have a Linux machine, then inside a Linux machine, or let's say because Mac is internally, I have a Mac, so you can do it in Mac because it has a similar architecture. If you execute a command env, can you see there is a lot of variables that are actually coming up? There are a lot of variables that you are able to see here, right? What are these variables, right? These are actually environment variables, right? These are actually environment variables. So these environment variables will be accessible to your code, right? For example, you can set a new environment variable, right? I believe there's something like, okay, so let's just quickly Google. If you want to set an environment variable in Linux, what you can actually do. So set env variable Linux. Okay, that should be some very simple command. So you can do export. Okay, so there is I guess if you want to, so there is a keyword set that you can use in Windows as far as I remember, and export is for Linux environment. So you can do something like export, and let's say you can export an environment variable like, let's say Sanket is equals to instructor. Okay, something like this. Okay, and you don't need to pass it as string, it will automatically infer it as that. and that's it. If now you do env, can you see there is a new variable Sanket is equals to instructor coming up, right? So now if you want to configure things in Express.js, if you want to configure a environment variable in Express.js, so there is a package called as .env. So you can do npm install .env. Okay, that's it, right? Now what .env enables you to do is, now with the power of .env, what you can do is you can create a .env file. Okay, it doesn't need to have any name. You can just create a .env extension based file. And here you can configure your variable. So for example, I keep a variable like port is equals to 3000. Okay, or let's say 3001 for example. Now by just creating this file, if I do env here and see, do we have a port variable? You can see there is no port variable. Like you can do env grep port. You can see there is no port variable. But if I do, let's say env grep Sanket, there was a Sanket variable, right? So it was able to find Sanket, but there is no port variable. So just creating this file will not help. Now you might think that, okay, maybe starting the server will help. So if I do npm start and then close the server and now do env grep port, you can see still it is not available. Like still just creating the file is not helping us to create a new environment variable. Using the export command, we could have done it, but how do we do that here? We have installed .env, we created a .env file. Now what you need to do is you need to configure it. You need to actually configure it as well. Okay. Now the simplest way to configure it is you first of all do let's say const .env is equals to require .env. Okay. So you have to require the package .env. Now what that .env package actually does is that it actually returns you an object. This .env actually returns you an object. Inside this .env object, you have access to a config method. You have access to a config method. Now, because we have required the .env package and that package actually returns us an object, that object has a config function. We called that function. What now it will do is, the moment you will start the server, it will try to access the root directory of your project. Inside that root directory, it will try to see whether there is a .env file or not. Once it finds a .env file, inside this .env file, it will parse all the environment variables. So let's try to see it. Now if I'll do npm start, you can see the server has started. If the server has successfully started, that means .env has actually parsed this .env file and created a brand new environment variable for you. Let's see if we are able to list down that here. See, we are still not able to list down that here, right? But if you try to access it, now you might be thinking, how do we access it? So in order to access it, you can write something like process.env.port. What is process? So process is kind of like a global variable that Node has. Just like in browser for JavaScript, you have global variables like document, right? You do document.getElement by ID anywhere. Here also you have a bunch of globals. So process is one of those globals. Require is one of those global variables, because this global variables directly kind of like takes a string argument. Process is a global object which has a env parameter where you can actually use .port. And let's try to access that inside this as well. Okay. So now if you try to execute your code, can you see it has started taking things from your environment variables directly here, right? Are you guys able to see this? That now it's not going on port 3000. It's no more going on port 3000. And instead what it is doing is it is actually going to port 3001. And where do we configure 3001? We actually configured 3001 on the .env file. Can I say that? So now it has actually started taking things from this .env file, right? It has actually started taking things from this .env file, right? Now one interesting thing let's try to do. Okay, so let's close the server and let's say we remove the port variable from this .env file, and let's say we manually do a export port is equals to 3002. Okay, now technically we have manually configured inside my OS a new environment variable. Can you see it has a new environment variable? What do you think will happen if I do npm start? The best way to answer this is to try it. If I do npm start, it takes 3002. That means now if let's say if somebody clones my code, and they don't have access to my .env file, right? If they want to start the server, they can also start the server by configuring the environment variables manually themselves. They can just do an export of a bunch of variables, and then because now those variables are now accessible there, still even if you don't have anything in the .env file, this process.env will work, right? So in fact, even if you don't have .env now, see, still you will be able to access 3002 because the process global variable is kind of like that document global variable in browser. So this process is independent of the .env package that you installed. .env package is just to make sure that you are able to create a .env file, and here all the variables are treated as a kind of like environment variables. But if you have the environment variables already configured, then you don't have to care about .env and anything. Process global will directly keep on accessing that. So what I can do is I can actually print process.env for you. Okay. So can you see this has printed the whole process.env, and all of these are environment variables that the current process has access to. Among these environment variables, if you will carefully see, you will find a port variable as well. And you can see we are able to access port 3002. Now this 3002 we configured where? We directly exported this 3002 variable, right? Now the question that should come to your mind is, okay, let's say we have a variable configured in the environment variable here. And let's say I configure a variable here also. Which one will take the precedence? Will it take the variable from the file if I have .env enabled? So how do you enable .env? Const .env is equals to require .env, and then we call .env.config. Okay. Now which one it will take? Let's try and see. Can you see it still takes the one in 3002, right? Because actually your environment already has port configured. If your environment already has port configured, then this env file is not going to take any precedence, right? As simple as that. Okay. Now, because I have exported this environment variable, will it stay here forever? No. So if I open a new console, let's say, and then actually execute this code, can you see in a new terminal session, that particular variable is no more accessible. In this new session, this variable was not accessible. Now if I do npm start, because this variable is now no more accessible inside this new terminal session, port 3001 will be picked. So this is how you can actually play with your, I would say, environment variables. Now, making your environment variables lie around in your actual index.js file is not a good practice. Why? Because index.js is actually the main server code. It actually contains a lot of server configurations. It is generally not recommended to bloat it with everything. Okay. So what you can actually do is I can create a new folder, and we will call that folder as config. Inside that folder, I'll create a new file, and I will call it as server. Let's call it as server config.js. Okay. And instead of writing this .env logic here, I'll write this logic here, and what I'll do is from here I'm going to actually export an object. So I'll create a object called as const env variables. I'll create an object. Inside this object, I'll put the key as port and the value as process.env.port, right? Because process is a global variable, so it's accessible across your node project, right? And then what I can do is I can actually export this environment variable. So if you have done any kind of React coding, then you might have seen things like export default something or export something, right? But here, because we are using a require based syntax, that means we are using common JS moduling. So technically what we should do is we should say module.exports is equals to environment variables. Now what will happen is this whole object is going to be exported. And what we can do here is that we can say const is equals to require dot slash config slash server config, right? So when you will require server config, what happens is it is going to export a object. See, how do you export any variable? You can export an object, you can export a function, you can export a variable, anything you can export by doing module.exports, right? And because it's an object, so we can destructure the object. So we'll destructure the object like this here, port. And now we don't need this port variable altogether. And instead of saying process.env.port, I will just say port. And I will just say port. And we will remove this and save it. And now if I restart, oh sorry, there is a typo here somewhere. Require. Can you see now the port server has started on port 3001, and you can see the code looks more cleaner, right? If let's say we will configure more environment variables, like let's say something like db underscore url is equals to some db url, right? So if at any point of time we have to use it in any file, either we will do again .env config, like either we will repeat these two pieces of code in every file, or what we will do is inside this server config, I will just add a db underscore url as process.env.db underscore url, and wherever I have to access it, I will just require this and get access to db url. So if we want, we can even use the db url. So this is going to be beneficial in that kind of a case, right? So this will make your code more cleaner and modular. I'm removing db url for a moment, but I believe you got the point. So that's how you can actually config your environment variables in a clean way using .env, right? So I'll commit this much. Here we go. Now there is a significant issue with the current piece of code. Currently you see we have one file and we are just bombarding that particular file with all of our logic. Let's say I want to introduce, let's say 5, 7, 10 more routes. I will be implementing all of them in the same file. So definitely this code needs some level of segregation, that our logic should be technically separated out from this particular file. We should have dedicated logical separation, right? So there is something called as a single responsibility principle that is getting violated here, because currently a lot of things are getting done in this single file, and the only purpose of this file should be more or less the configuration of the server. So now the question that should come to your mind is, how should we do the segregation? Now one level of segregation though directly we can do by putting these functions separately. Can you see, like, these are just callback functions, right? What I could have done is I could have made a new file, put these functions in that particular file, and imported those functions and used here. So let's say somehow we imported the function fn and we could have used that here, right? This would have definitely made a bunch of cleanups for us, right? So we need some kind of a code segregation altogether, right? That is going to be important. But in order to understand that what's the industry standard for this kind of a code segregation, we need to understand a architecture called as the MVC architecture. To be very honest, as of now, we don't even follow the exact MVC architecture. There are a bunch of extensions that we follow in the MVC architecture, but still we're going to take a look at the MVC architecture. We are going to try to understand that what are the different components inside your application and how those components are going to be communicating with each other, and what is the logical separation, that what particular component is going to handle which particular part of your application.